second presentation in the 2019 Political Ecology Lecture Series. Some of you attended the first lecture with Mukul Sharma last Thursday, and I appreciate your interest. And I invite you to attend our next talk, which will be held on Wednesday, April 10th in Classroom 4 during our Political Ecology class. You can just come in and join our class. Don't worry about it. You don't even have to do the reading. And feel free to join us as we visit with Radika Borda, who's a faculty member at Charles University in the Czech Republic. She'll focus on a topic called Rallying Around Sacred Natural Sites, Adivasi Mobilizations in India, Claims Making and the Reforestation of Sacred Groves. And like Mukul Sharma, she will talk about the political ecology of indigenous peoples and their sacred places in Jharkhand, India. So it'll be an interesting comparative piece, to say the least. I met today's speaker way back in the fall of 2014 when she was a student in my political ecology class, and she distinguished herself very quickly by being super friendly. And right after that, she distinguished herself even more by being super serious, self-disciplined, and passionate about the subject. I will not forget how motivated she became after we read Judith Carney's Agro-Environments and Slave Strategies in the Diffusion of Rice Culture to the Americas. And that was pretty early in the semester. I think we all pause and think and rethink the history of slavery in the Americas when we realize that West African slaves were not only forced through the Middle Passage, but those who survived created an extensive agro-ecosystem based on their extensive knowledge of African rice, which is, for you botanists, Oryza glaberrima. It's different from Oryza sativa, but it provided a knowledge base that was phenomenally important. So these agro-ecosystems and how to reproduce them in highly local, intensive upland versions and extensive rice fields in the estuarine environments of Georgia and South Carolina and North Florida were really the exclusive traditional environmental knowledge of those West African slaves. As Carney explains, the commodity value of their output was greater than that of their bodies, which was unusual even in U.S. slavery, and they lived in horrifyingly bad conditions because slave owners simply did not care. Why is not only their labor but also their knowledge erased from the historical records? How do we foreground not only their sacrifices and losses but also their genius in adapting to an alien environment as they calculated how best to decrease their hours under essentially press gang labor and to get into task-based labor systems that were developed around their brilliance. And also how to escape beyond the boundaries of the U.S. into Central and South Florida. So this was a very agentive, complicated hydroengineering project in the estuarine environments and some upland environments as well. At the end of the semester, our speaker wrote an outstanding paper called Sugar, Slaves, and Social Norms, which starts with the following paragraph. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. Sugar, Slaves, and Social Norms is based on the migration patterns of Africans into the Americas as a direct result of European alleged discovery of the sugarcane plant. Aside from my own ancestral connections to this topic, I am interested in figuring out how the origin of things and knowing why, knowing why they occur. My maternal great-grandmother is from the island of St. Lucia, and grandfather is from a common African settlement area in South Carolina, where a crossover language and culture called Gullah was created. Being a female of African descent, I have faced lots of obstacles and injustices in this post-racism 21st century world. There is still an underlying stigma towards the black community and darker-skinned people in the Americas as a whole. This is one of the many results of slavery and the superiority complex that has been embedded in the minds of many Europeans and fair-skinned individuals in our world. Because she enrolled in our 3-1 articulation program with Vermont Law School, our speaker raced through her BA courses at Simon's Rock, including her thesis in 3 years. I was lucky to be her thesis advisor in her junior year in 2016 and 2017 when I had 7 thesis advisees. She met with me once a week, and we convened the whole group once a week for mutual support. And she was always there early. She was at those meetings early, and she always had plenty to show for her week of work. Plus, she was always upbeat, and I kid you not. Her thesis was masterful and won high honors, and it's entitled Government and the Voiceless City, a case study on the Flint, Michigan water crisis and state-community relations, and I will let her tell you the rest. But before I do that, I will add that our speaker was not always sequestered away in the library. She was very active and all around campus, and among other things, she organized what must have been the biggest and most glorious gospel concerts that this campus has ever seen. And surprise, surprise, she was a star soloist in those concerts. So every time I talk to this alumna, I hear her news, and I'm always inclined to ask, wow, what's next? And sure enough, this time it was another big wow. She's heading down to Duke in a couple days, right, for a big conference on legal something rather. And she helped arrange it. So let's wait and give our speaker a very warm homecoming. And first, I would like to encourage Rebecca Guy to give her introduction as well.
It's always bad when you have something to say after Chris, because he just writes everything so well. So here's my part. I would like to thank everyone for coming to Arielle's talk this evening. Her topic of interest is surely one that encompasses many concerns that are constantly most pressing and most relevant to our lives. Arielle's contributions to Simon's Rock have not only applied to her academic career. She served as a PM for the Crosby House, and I missed her. I missed her just by like a semester or something. Has organized annual gospel concerts, as Chris spoke on, and has served this very location as an amazing student representative for admissions. There are many more items to add to the list that I haven't mentioned, and it's just too many. I would be here forever if I were to list all of them. Her inviting spirit has contributed greatly to the heart of Simon's Rock, and she continues to keep in touch and inspire the student body. Our friendship was created under very unlikely circumstances, as after she left for Vermont Law and I transferred into Simon's Rock, we got even closer. And now she is a strong part of my life and is a family member in my eyes. She's intelligent, creative, fashionable, strong-willed, and truly a force of all good things. Please join me in welcoming Arielle King, my best friend, future lawyer, SR alum, human plant, sister, and environmental guru.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. That was a lot. Those are my 2 favorite humans, like, aside from these other humans right here who like created me. Wow, okay, we're good, okay. So, welcome. This talk is kind of a culmination of my greatest interests, which are understanding political ecology and environmental racism. So during my time so far at Vermont Law School, I've done a lot to increase awareness of what environmental racism, particularly environmental justice, is. And I would just like to share the evolution of that with you all today. So, political ecology is the representation of a distinct alternative to apolitical ecology, which doesn't take into consideration socio-cultural perspectives. Paul Robbins, affectionately referred to by some as the father of political ecology, believes that this theory includes addressing the roles of human labor in environmental metabolism, the nature of risk-taking and risk aversion in human behavior, diversity of environmental perceptions, and causes and effects of political corruption, and relationships between knowledge and power. In this lecture, we'll briefly touch on each of these topics. Understanding political ecology is what will help us create respectful, inclusive, meaningful strategies and policies to combat climate change, because environmental degradation has continually been a driver of global instability, which derives from colonization, white greed, and the blatant disregard for the lives of the other, or people whose space in this world has been deemed to hold lesser value. A recent study found that when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they caused so much death and disease that it literally changed the global climate. European settlers killed 56 million indigenous people over 100 years in South, Central, and North America, which caused large swaths of farmland to be abandoned and reforested. This reforestation, it resulted in a massive decrease in carbon dioxide due to the lack of humans, which caused carbon levels to change enough to cool the Earth by the year 1610, 118 years after Columbus arrived in 1492.
Oh, no, it's not. And actually, I just
200 million to 1 billion environmental migrants or climate refugees will be forced from their homes by the end of the year 2050. And no state, federal, or international governing body has implemented any policies in preparation to assist these individuals. These climate refugees inevitably are and will continue to be low-income, minority, and indigenous communities who have already suffered from environmental trauma, political neglect, and structural oppression and violence. Groups that meet these characteristics are now commonly referred to as environmental justice communities. Environmental degradation is a racial issue. Unfortunately, for far too long, ecological preservation movements have disregarded the lived experience and significant contributions that people of color have made to improve and preserve the environment, because the racial majority has created a singular mode of identifying and defining environmentalism. Traditional environmentalism is defined as a liberal, rights-based philosophy and social movement concerned with protecting and bettering the environment. However, this ideology is fundamentally a European and Euro-American historical phenomenon. We, as in African slaves who bore the future generations of Black Americans, were excluded in the creation of the human archetype, while working tirelessly for no wages to create the American dream for white plantation owners. Black bodies in particular were captured, brought to the Americas, intentionally separated from our families, cultures, and history to forcibly clear indigenous lands, transform their ecology, and reassemble them into Euroscapes. Black bodies were fundamental to the construction of the plantation as a white space where white settler masters could dwell and self-actualize the archetypical human. These bodies were used to construct this space as that of civil society, thus unintentionally and unwillingly preventing themselves from ever dwelling within that space fully, despite laws and policies that have promised equal treatment of all people, like the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, for example. Not including the lived experiences and contributions of African slaves to the success of this country is harmful. It is erasure. Merely assuming that European settlers chose Africans to be slaves in the New World because of their perceived superiority erases the knowledge of agriculture and growing habits that were brought with us to the New World that caused plantations to thrive. A clear, visible distinction between Africans and their white settler masters through skin color was a convenient bonus, but not the sole reason for the capture and import of slaves to the Americas to build this New World. Once sugarcane's domestication and production proved successful in the 15 and 1600s, the next crop mass-produced in the Americas was rice, which became the dominant crop by the mid-1700s. The small-scale farming that settlers noticed in West Africa transformed into the great industrial management of rice for the benefit and profit of white master settlers. Unsurprisingly, there's a significant lack of research and knowledge on the impact of Africans' prior knowledge to agricultural processes, but many political ecologists, including Judith Carney, who Chris mentioned, believe that providing research to this topic will debunk the myth that Africans were taken captive and brought into this new world merely because they were easily accessible, easily manipulated, unskilled workers. A few weeks ago, during a festival of stage reading celebrations of black female playwrights in White River Junction, Vermont, called JAGFest. No, I'm not the only black person living in Vermont. There was one play called Blanks or Sunday Afternoon After Church, written by Gethsemane Amy Heron Coward. This incredible show follows the life of a black med student named Reese and touches on themes of intimate partner violence, intersectional patriarchy, and neglect that affects black women's pursuits of love. The line that resonated with me since I saw the show last month was uttered by the only other black woman in Reese's med school class at Maryland University in the early 2000s. A black doula passionate about giving women a voice and decreasing the mortality rate of black mothers during childbirth. She said, "Racism is so thorough." Racism is so thorough. As you listen to the rest of this presentation, as you go through your daily lives, absorbing information and noticing injustices, I want you to think about how thorough racism truly is. This talk is also entitled Environmental Racism. This particular phenomenon is defined as the racial discrimination in environmental policy making and the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of people of color communities for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership in the environmental movement. Currently, environmental racism has become one of the biggest threats to people of color. Environmental racism is the means for understanding why urban planning has always been segregated by race and income levels, putting the poor people of color near waste disposal treatment plants, factories, highways, gas stations, and other things deemed unclean and undesirable in more affluent neighborhoods. Environmental racism is what gave rise to the environmental justice movement. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, EJ is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of all race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And the environmental justice movement is the fight against the systematic targeting of those who lack the social, economic, and political clout to bear environmental burdens so that others can benefit without harm. These communities are characterized by the intentional or unintentional, often systematic targeting of the communities based on those characteristics, and or the lackluster or non-existent response from government in response to whatever these atrocities are, this trauma that these communities are facing. So in order to really give you an idea of what environmental justice is, I like to show a brief history of the evolution of environmental justice in that particular movement. And it really starts in 1968 with the Memphis sanitation strike. This was Martin Luther King Jr.'s last protest. It was the result of on February 1st of 1968, 2 Memphis garbage collectors were crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck. 11 days later, frustrated by the city's response to the latest event and a long pattern of neglect and abuse of its black communities, 1,300 black men from the Memphis Department of Public Works went on strike. After over a month of protesting, Martin Luther King joined the movement in early March, which turned environmental justice into a national awareness issue. And so on the night before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King uttered these words: "We've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at this point in Memphis. We've got to see it through." So just understanding the lack of response, that's one instance of a method of showing environmental justice and how it can come to fruition. Another important part of the environmental justice movement was the Warren County Sit-In. Some claim that this is the initial spark of the environmental justice movement. Warren County is a small, predominantly black area in North Carolina. And in 1982, this community was the target of a landfill. And this landfill was seeping out PCBs and affecting waterways, soil, which was obviously harming food. And as a result, community members were stopping the trucks that were going to be, stopping the garbage trucks that were continuing to bring the trash and all of the toxins into their communities, which caused a whole bunch of other issues, as you would expect. And this issue wasn't remediated until 29 years later. So this is just the continuous, perpetual cycle of communities fighting for access, fighting to be heard, and receiving nothing back. Next was the Toxics, Waste, and Race in the United States report. This report is focused in New York City, and it came out in the late 80s. And it shows it was the first report to show the correlation between zoning laws and just the understanding that low-income communities are almost always near waste disposal facilities, and then it correlated that with health disparities in minority communities. In New York City, it's very obvious. If you look at a map of the city, anytime that there's extreme highways, there are high-rise projects, apartments, right? Like that, it's just, and we don't even see it as an issue. And a lot of members of these communities are facing extreme health issues as a result of living near these areas and don't have the access or don't have the political clout to even argue or stand up for themselves in order to advocate for something to become better. So that's where I want to come in this world. So following that was the 1991 first United Nations National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. Here is where the 17 principles of environmental justice were created and published. The profound preamble of the principles reads, "We the people of color gathered together at this multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit to begin to build a national and international movement of all peoples of color to fight the destruction and taking of our lands and communities, do hereby establish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of Mother Earth." How beautiful is that? I love it. So this was the first opportunity where we started to understand the intersections of environmental justice. So this is where issues of public health and worker safety and land use and transportation and housing and resource allocation and community empowerment as a whole were kind of blended together and brought to the forefront, with community leaders from all over the world just kind of becoming more aware of these issues. Next was the 1994 executive order that President Clinton issued. The issue with executive orders is that they don't hold much weight unless there's actual legislation that's put in place following them to reinforce their existence. So this particular executive order was a federal action to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. Sounds legit. And it was issued by President Clinton, and its purpose was to focus federal attention on the environmental and human health effects of federal actions on minority and low-income populations with the goal of achieving environmental protection for all communities. And then nothing else happened. And this happens so often. So next, something that I could go on for hours and hours and hours about, in fact I wrote a whole thesis about it, is the Flint, Michigan water crisis. So this is a prime example of environmental justice, of an environmental justice issue. Just to give you some basic facts on the crisis, and then I'll go into more detail. On April 25th of 2014, drinking water sources switched from Detroit's water source in Lake Huron to the Flint River as a temporary fix, and it was decided by the governor to appoint an emergency manager to make that decision. So Michigan has an emergency manager rule, which requires if a community is dealing with financial turmoil, a random person that's appointed by the governor comes into this community and just starts making decisions without the best interest of the community members in mind. It's just for money. It's a business person that's brought in, right? So the human aspects of government are completely revoked in that moment. So as a result, the Flint River was a dumping ground for untreated industrial waste for years. This was the site of a major General Motors factory starting in the early 20th century. And back then there weren't real environmental laws or regulations to prevent the dumping into rivers. And there were some remediation efforts in the year 2000, but this river was continually polluted with lead, magnesium, and other harmful chemicals. And the first photo that you see is a clear distinction between the Flint water and the water that the members of the community members in Flint were initially getting. But the issue with the Flint water crisis was mostly one resulting from bad planning. This community, when it was first built, when it was first created, when it was first planned, was able to hold a certain amount of community members, right? Like 200,000 community members. And when this crisis occurred, it was at less than half of that capacity as a result of jobs leaving once the General Motors factories left. It's a prime example of a post-industrial town that is just struggling. So just some statistics on the buildup of the breakdown of the communities. 42% of the population is living below the poverty line. And in Flint, that means that approximately $28,000 per year for family of 5 and less than half of the state median household income. And the racial population was 56.6% black. So this is the perfect storm of an environmental justice community that is just being affected in the most egregious ways from political neglect. So unfortunately, the Flint water crisis has not been resolved at all. There were lots of efforts to switch the water back, but the trust wasn't there. So even when pipes were being replaced, even when community members were being told that it was safe to drink the water again, would you? I mean, after being lied to by your government, after being told for so long that something was safe when it actually wasn't, when it's actually killing children. And so every child in the city of Flint, Michigan, under the age of, I believe, 7 now at this point, has been contaminated with lead poisoning. So that's going to push just the evolution of that city back generations. Because as we know, lead contributes to brain damage and neurological issues that we still haven't been able to fully understand and fully comprehend. And we won't really be able to see the effects of these issues until many years down the line. Unfortunately, Flint has been able to receive a lot of money especially from the Obama administration. So when it was declared a state of emergency in 2016, the Obama administration told every single agency in the government to just give some money to Flint. So, I mean, this is good, right? Unfortunately, that money could only be allocated to certain things, so it couldn't just be given to replace all of the pipes if it's coming from different agencies. So the Department of Transportation had to focus on their realm, and so that limited the ability for this crisis to be resolved in a timely manner. Additionally, people just aren't listening. People just aren't listening. And one thing that I mentioned in my thesis was that the crisis didn't even really make it to national news until a white mother complained about it. There were about 5 different black mothers who were going to community meetings, that were going to government agencies, being like, my children are being harmed by this, there are rashes on my children, I don't know what's happening. and no one listened. So those are some of the main issues related to environmental justice. So what are some of the solutions? Thinking about the ways that we can use the law to understand ways to combat environmental justice. Unfortunately, there is no mention of environmental justice in any environmental laws that are created today, that have been created in the 1970s. So there needs to be a radical shift in the way that we talk about the environment, in the way that we include all people in environmental understanding. So I recently spoke to one of the directors of the NRDC, which is the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the NRDC was started in the 60s, so he was very inspired by the civil rights movement. And he recently said that one of his main regrets in starting the NRDC was not involving the people of color that he admired so much and who he modeled so much of his work after in the practices that he did. And as a result, he and so many other of the big green organizations just don't have connections to environmental justice or to people of color, and as a result, we're minimizing the impacts that we can make in these communities because we're not listening and we're not acknowledging the lived experiences of these communities. Another issue that is happening is that we're not able to understand as a result of that. So something that my law society, so last year I helped to create the Environmental Justice Law Society at Vermont Law School. And something that we do is we teach the community what environmental justice is. So we go to schools, we've been asked to come to different organizations and give trainings on what EJ is. And it has different forms, it looks very different in different locations. So if we're thinking about Flint, it's going to be very different than what it would look like in Vermont, for example. In Vermont, environmental justice looks like helping low-income farmers with agricultural runoff going into their waterways, right? Because they're not receiving the attention and the care that they deserve in dealing with those issues. They're being politically neglected, which is so interesting to think about in a super progressive Vermont, but it's real. And just thinking about Hoosick Falls, issues there were so directly correlated with the Flint water crisis, but it was on a smaller scale, and they were able to be remediated a lot faster. There was a greater response just because of the demographic of the community that was being affected there. So what the Environmental Justice Law Society is doing now is we're trying to propose legislation to hold the state of Vermont accountable for EJ issues. So we are going to different EJ communities throughout the state, and we're asking them, how can we help you? If you could change one thing about your community and about your community environment, what would it be? And just understanding that there needs to be a very intersectional understanding of what solutions can be and what they can look like. So that's the only way that we're going to get things done, right? Is if we understand things on a very macro scale. So that's pretty much the bulk of my presentation. Does anyone have questions about anything that I brought up today? Thank you.
During the campaign, bringing up the Flint water crisis, but I have not heard any national figure talk about it since then.
Yeah.
Is there a champion for the issue, or have people just forgotten about it?
I feel like, from what I've seen, there are a lot of organizations on the ground in Flint that are gaining traction and gaining attention, and I think that that's probably more important, to make sure that we have community members that are there doing the work, as opposed to big names that are coming in and then leaving, right? Because if we're doing that, then it minimizes the impact, because it's short term, right? If we're not connecting with the local members of community that are there, who are going to be there for a long time to kind of help watch the evolution of these issues. So that's one issue, but also I know that Will Smith's son has a water company, and he just sent a whole bunch of filters to Flint, and they're doing like really cool work with that. So there are some, celebrities who are still doing work. I feel like there's so many other issues happening in this world, in this political day and age, that it's hard to, focus on one particular issue. So, I mean, something that someone told me a long time ago was kind of pick your passion and work on it, and other people will do the same, so that not everyone is working on the same thing and everyone is helped, right? So that's something that I try to live by. So, like, the Flint water crisis is something that's important to me, and just understanding environmental justice on like a greater scale. So that's kind of how I'm approaching it. Yeah. Do you have other questions? Yes.
Is there maybe an intersection of your work, EJ, with federal programs such as Superfund sites and cleanup of Superfund sites? I just moved out here from Washington State, and Hanford Nuclear Plant, which was the West Coast cousin to Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
It's absolutely horrible how that site is being managed and what continues to go on. But it's a federal property and program.
Right.
So I mean, I don't know really if there's a question in that, but I'm just wondering, is there a difference between, say, a more kind of local, highly concentrated local situation like Flint versus how you could approach a federal problem?
Yeah. So dealing with federal issues generally depends on the president, right? So
Yes.
like an understanding that the president is the one who helps decide which agencies get which, like what amount of funds, right? So I've found that it's more beneficial to go to states and work with the state like sectors of whatever the federal agencies are. So generally they're easier to talk to, and and they don't generally change as often as like the federal ones do. And all state environmental agencies have like a Superfund site, have a water quality department, have all of those things. So I feel like working kind of not as local as a city, but just kind of working within a state realm is probably more beneficial, especially within this administration. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
How has the, thank you for this, and it's really good to see you. How has the international EJ community and conversation evolved since the UN 1991 resolution? And then how can students now who are interested in these topics get involved?
Yeah, okay. So, answer to your first question, there hasn't been much growth, unfortunately. So I took an international environmental law class, and I found that during these conferences, a lot of countries will come together and make these phenomenal treaties that just make a lot of sense and they make a lot of change, but there's very little enforcement in the international environmental realm, and as a result, there aren't significant ramifications if treaties aren't being followed, or if you aren't a party to the treaty, you don't even have to listen to what the treaty says. So it's a very interesting, and it's more based on courtesy that like international agreements, particularly in the environmental realm, are formed and continue. So some countries will decide that they're not going to deal with countries that aren't treaties to particular issues. They won't trade with those countries, something like that, but that doesn't happen often. Which is very unfortunate. So, I mean, there is certainly a need to increase the enforcement and the kind of compliance understandings of environmental laws and policies on an international, but even on a national level here in the U.S. So then to answer your second question, well, it depends. So, I mean, I'm sure that there are issues right here in the state of Massachusetts that students can get involved in. And something that's really important is, one, knowing what the issues are, and two, kind of asking communities, like, what are you looking for? Like, what do you need help with? And also, like, public notice and comment, like when legislation is coming in, that talks about issues, if there's opposition, like maybe having a group of students like write against the legislation and talk about why it's not a good idea, and like doing that background information, giving that data might change someone's mind. So that's definitely an important thing to consider.
Thank
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about Vermont law in terms of its commitment to teaching courses on environmental justice? And you just mentioned this course on international environmental law. So how have you found, I know you've started the organization there, so can you talk to us about legal training and these ways that really surprisingly articulate with a lot of the things in political ecology that we've talked about over the years?
Yeah. So actually, we created the Environmental Justice Law Society because there was a lack of environmental justice education at Vermont Law School. We wanted to fill that niche for ourselves, and we, aside from like seeking like speaking engagements that we can do and give to other people, we bring in speakers so that we can get that information that we need. So calling ourselves a student group has been able to allow us to access funding to pay people to come and talk to us, which has definitely been extremely helpful for us to just better understand these issues. But we do a lot of readings on our own, and we have like a reading group within our society to just kind of advance our knowledge. So the conference that Chris was talking about and saying that I'm helping plan at Duke, it's in conjunction with Duke's Law School and the Yale School of Public Health, and it's at the end of this week, and we're talking about climate preparedness and what that will look like for environmental justice communities, understanding that EJ communities are going to be the greatest affected by climate change, and especially ones living on the coast when sea levels are rising, and what that will look like. So just understanding that there needs to be policy implementation as soon as possible to make sure that these communities are being protected, or at least moved safely without, completely disrupting culture and history and all of those things. Yes. Does anyone else have questions? No? All right, well, that is all.